Hello everybody, and a very warm welcome back to the Lockdown LitFest, where we have one hell of an event for you today, which also marks a rather important anniversary, but we'll come to that in a little while. I'd like to introduce you to Katharine McMahon, who studied English and drama at Bristol University. She's taught and trained extensively, both in creative writing and within the criminal justice system, and currently works for the Royal Literary Fund, developing projects that help writers use their unique skills in the community. She's the author of no fewer than 10 novels, which include The Alchemist's Daughter, The Crimson Rooms, Confinement, After Mary, Season of Light, and The Woman in the Picture, that focus largely on astonishing women and their ability to find a voice, even at times and in societies where they're risking everything. For those of you that watch TV, and why wouldn't you, The Rose of Sebastopol, which we're here to talk about today, was a Richard and Judy pick and a Sunday Times bestseller. Katharine McMahon, it's a great pleasure to be able to say welcome to the Lockdown LitFest.
Thank you, it's great to be here.
Well, it's lovely to see you. I am locked down in the midst of this COVID-19 horror in rural Warwickshire with my 8-year-old dad. Tell us, where in the world are you?
Well, I'm in a shed where I work, and it's in the garden of our flat in London.
And are you safe? Are you well? Do you have company? Are you going slowly insane? Do you have enough food?
I'm finding I like it a little bit too much, like a lot of writers, I think. Those of us who are fortunate enough to be well, it seems to be quite a relief to be tucked away and not having to face the world.
Are you finding you're doing more writing? I've spoken to a few author pals who are saying that for the first time in a long time, they're finding that because they're locked down, because they can't go anywhere, because they're at home, they have everything they need. They're feeling more like writers, more like authors, more like poets than they felt in some time, rather than having to sort of do the time-consuming pressures of publicizing books coming out, going on tours, going to live literary festivals, which of course we've set up the Lockdown LitFest in order to replace.
Well, I'm always very happy to do anything to do with writing and my books, I have to say. But yeah, I think the discipline of writing is easier when you can't go anywhere, and there's certainly more time. In fact, in some ways, there's too much time. I like having the discipline of writing for a few hours and then going off and doing something different. Whereas now I write and then have to do screen work, which is, it's tough, I really can't complain.
It's good, and you're obviously well and looking after yourself and being careful and being alert, as the government has us.
Staying alert, yes.
Exactly, whatever that might mean.
Yeah.
Can we do a little bit about your career before we get stuck into the writing itself? Because, before we get stuck into the books themselves, because you have a sort of an interesting background. You qualified as a teacher of English and drama and taught at the Hertfordshire Comprehensive, if memory serves. And then are you currently an advisory fellow at the University of Hertfordshire?
I'm actually employed now by the Royal Literary Fund part-time, right. And my job is to set up projects in what we call the social sector, so enabling writers to earn money through the Royal Literary Fund by working with people who wouldn't normally have access to a professional writer. So we work with ex-prisoners, with hospital staff, disabled children or children with learning difficulties, anyone really with whom we can set up a project where they might benefit from the interface with a writer. We don't do creative writing, we do expressive writing, reflective writing, helping people to write professionally better.
I'm interested in the distinction between creative writing and expressive writing and so on. Could you pick that apart for us?
Well, the Royal Literary Fund, I don't know whether you know, but writers are employed initially to work in universities. Hilary Spurling came up with this brilliant idea that the Royal Literary Fund's charter won't allow it to pay writers to write, but it pays writers to do things to do with public education. And so what Hilary Spurling came up with was this great scheme where they put writers into universities to work one-to-one with students on their academic writing, not their creative writing. And we learned through that whatever you are, if you're a poet, a novelist, I studied drama, but I was able to help philosophy students and physics students because the principles of good writing are always the same.
Yes,
it's all about clarity and your audience. And so from that, we learned that actually writers don't always have to teach creative writing. They've got extraordinary other skills that they can use for the community.
Absolutely. That's well described. Can I shed a light on another area of your life? I like your social engagement. You're also a magistrate.
Yes, actually, I'm not anymore because I thought I'd done it for 30 years and that was really long enough. But yeah, I was a magistrate, and I think it's been a huge contribution to my literary life, really. Apart from giving me skills, extraordinary skills, I think you learn, and being engaged with the criminal justice system, it also gave me an alternative career, which is rather more rewarding than writing tends to be. You know, there's nothing like being in a courtroom. I don't call that my career, actually, but being in a courtroom, it's very immediate setting. But also I've been involved in training and with, you know, decision making within the criminal justice system, which has been extraordinary for me, really.
Catherine, we have you on here as a writer, and yet you're saying your job as a magistrate was more rewarding. How can that possibly be?
Well, you know, it's quite a slow burn writing a book, isn't it? You write for 3 years, you publish it, you get one review, and then bang, that's it. Bang.
The stories endure in people's mind for a long time after that.
Let's hope, yes. But I mean, in terms of actually going into court, sitting in a bench of 3 and making really important decisions about people's lives, that is very immediate, and it's really engaged, and I feel it's about the human exchange in a way that sitting in my writing shed is not really. Except with you, sitting talking to you is obviously.
Oh, you're very kind, you're very kind. Can we come to 1990, which seems to mark a sea change in your career, because if I've done my research correctly, that's when you launched your account as a historical novelist. What I'm interested in is what led up to that. These things don't just come out of the blue. So there was obviously the will to write. There was obviously the will to be a storyteller. There was obviously, one would imagine, a fascination for history. I'm telling you stuff about yourself you already know, of course. What I want to ask is, when did you think, hold on, I've read a lot of history, I've read a lot of novels, there's a storyteller in me and I want to exercise that?
I think I was always going to write or act. That was my plan when I went to Bristol to do English and drama. And I realised early on, you know, talent aside, I just didn't have the personality to be an actor. And I just didn't like the immediacy of the competition. I mean, I think writing is very competitive, actually, but at least it's sort of hidden. So as soon as I finished Bristol, my parents brought me a portable typewriter. That shows me how old I am. And I learned to touch type and started to write novels which were routinely rejected, the first 2 or 3. But that was finally I wrote A Way Through the Woods, and obviously that was published, and that was the beginning of my career. But I hadn't intended to be a historical novelist. I'd always, for the first 3 books, I think I wrote in the present and the past, or mixed up times in my novels. And then suddenly, I think it was After Mary, which was the least successful book in some ways, but was the most sort of purely historical novel that I'd written. And that was really the switch. It gave me the confidence to start to really immerse myself in the past.
That's interesting. I like the way that you put this. So least successful, do you mean commercially or in terms of awards, but most successful in terms of charting your course as a novelist?
Yes, oddly enough, I suspect. I mean, I think I'd sort of found my voice. You know, everyone talks about finding your voice, but I think I had found my voice in novels that I'd written before that. But After Mary was set entirely in the past. It's sort of concerned with a woman who, an extraordinary woman who is her uncle and family are engaged in the Gunpowder Plot. So it's set in about 1605, and but it was unsuccessful. It's very kind of religious novel. She's a Roman Catholic. She was a female Jesuit. So it's quite a niche, I'd say. I'd encourage people to read it, obviously, but it's niche. But that set me on the course to thinking how extraordinary women in the past were. And I think that's my theme, really, that I've found time and after time, I just can't work out why women have been so quiet all these years when there have always been standout, extraordinary women. And that's what I've been sort of writing about.
It's an important voice to find. I like the reference to the Gunpowder Plot because, of course, where I'm locked down is the heartland of where so many of the contributors and players and actors in the plot sort of form themselves, coalesce in a village just not far north of where I am.
Very Catholic area.
It's perhaps an unfair question to ask you, but Do you have an answer to the question you posed yourself, that you can't work out why women's voices have been quieted for so long? What do you put that down to?
A lot of it is down to education. Most of the women who do succeed or did succeed had the most extraordinary education for any number of reasons. I mean, it's often to do with having a parent who's a educator. So Florence Nightingale, for example, her father taught her mathematics, and I think that was very seminal in her development. And I think other characters that I've based my fiction on, it's always education. It's always often have to be quite highborn in order to have the luxury of that education. But I think that's what's always key, plus an extraordinary standout sort of ability of being in the right moment at the right time. The Alchemist daughter is based on Émilie du Châtelet, who was a French mathematician, and again, you know, it was to do with education, with her extraordinary education, and the fact that she married the right people.
And an evolved father that understood the importance of education for all his children, not just his sons.
Exactly, and then a partner marriage which enables you extraordinary freedom to exercise those skills. But of course, Florence Nightingale was a huge rebel. Everyone conspired to keep her down, and she popped up.
Exactly. Well, before we come to Florence, I was talking to Malala Yousafzai's father just a couple of weeks ago. He's going to be a guest in this LitFest in a few weeks' time, we hope. And I was having the conversation with him about that, about what inspired him, because of course we now know Malala as being a fantastic advocate for children's education, for girls' education, in nations where it is not quite as prevalent as one might hope, or as they might hope. And I was asking him because having read The Rose of Sebastopol and having read The Alchemist's Daughter in the past, both your fine books, I was interested to know what it felt like from the father's perspective. And he said, it just takes courage to know that you're doing the right thing. And he said, the thing was that Malala has paid for my courage in a way that I could never have paid. But the courage has to come from the parent. And your job, if you have a child, is to give your child the courage to do the right thing.
Yeah.
So that was rather insightful. And I've got goosebumps, as I said. Catherine, you've mentioned Florence a couple of times. So let's bring us on to the novel that we're really here to talk about. The Sunday Times bestseller, a heart-stopping tale of love and war called The Rose of Sebastopol, which introduces us to this extraordinary character, Rosa Barden. So can we start at the top? And can I ask you the very simple question, because like all good books, there's a seed of an idea somewhere that takes a lot of thought, a lot of research, a lot of consideration before you even start putting pen to paper. What was the seed from which this book grew?
Well, I should say this book it was my 5th book, and I've just reissued it with another chapter, which we perhaps will come to. But it was the fact that I was always going to write a novel about Florence Nightingale. I think went back to childhood. I had a Ladybird book of Florence Nightingale, and I was obsessed by the pictures, literally obsessed. I think it was to do with she comes across as an iconic, almost a fairy tale figure, and with that lamp. And the fact that she transformed her life as well as other people's. So it was a sort of reverse Cinderella story, I think. And so then I went on to read the biographies. But when I wrote The Alchemist's Daughter, which was about a woman in science and set in the 17th century, or the 18th century, my century's muddled, sort of the next step was really to think about women and in science in England. And I realised that, you know, the first woman doctor was 1860, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. And took me I was on the brink of writing about doctors, really. But then I thought it was too tempting to go back to Florence Nightingale. And so that's how it began. And then, of course, I found myself in very deep water with the Crimean War and all sorts.
What do you mean deep water?
I started writing the novel and then realised I don't really know anything about war, or I've never been in a war zone, and how am I going to get to Sebastopol, because you can't really write if you haven't been somewhere. Quite. So I'd set myself quite a large task. It turned out to be a sort of very grand project. So
talk me through the research. It sounds fascinating. What was your first start? What was your starting point? Did you Did you jump on a plane and find yourself in the Crimean Peninsula?
Well, it was really weird because I'm not a brave traveller at all, and I soon realised that I don't have Ukrainian, and Simferopol Airport was very inaccessible in those days.
Yeah.
But it was actually very close to the 150th anniversary of the Crimean War. And Voyage d'Auvergne, the travel company, put an ad at the back of the Telegraph, which I don't read, but my dad did. And I just happened to be browsing through it, and it had a ridiculous £395 package to the Crimea for 10 days, view of the walls, and take you around all the war sites. So I got hold of a friend and off we went. And it was the most extraordinary experience. And what's more, because I was halfway through the book, it gave me the answers to a lot of questions that I didn't know the answer to. Notably, what had happened to my heroine, Rosa, who disappears in the novel.
Exactly. We'll talk about that in a bit. So what did you find when you got there, once you come out of Simferopol Airport and find yourself walking on the hallowed ground that so many writers have written about, both fiction and non-fiction?
Yeah, it was extraordinary. I mean, the first thing was to do with the weather. The Crimea looks like a bit of lovely Devon, really, from the sea. It's very beautiful landscape. And when we arrived, it was late September or early October, and it was warm. And by the end of the week, it was so cold, you really didn't be able to stand up in the cold. It was bitter, bitter cold that you don't experience in England. And that's exactly what happened to our troops in the Crimean War. They arrived in sunshine. They were told to leave all their winter uniforms on the ships, and they began to march inland, and immediately the cold hit them. So you kind of realise that this was a very seductively deceptive landscape that we found ourselves in, and that was one of the reasons for the catastrophe that was the Crimean War.
I'm pleased you used the word landscape there, because the landscape in the Rose of Sebastopol is as much a part of the character of the narrative and the character as the characters that you write about, as Rosa, as for Mariela, so many of the characters that you populate this with. Can you just explain, for those that don't write, but those that read in an evolved sense, what for an author, having a knowledge of that landscape, really gives to the story that you tell?
I think it's something to do with the way that we are and we react to our environment. And I think Mariela and Rosa are strangers in that landscape. And the way that you view a landscape, it very much reflects the way that you're feeling and the way that you, whatever is happening to you at the moment. So, you know, there's that, if you're feeling sad, you know, the romantics are very good at this. If you're feeling sad and it's raining outside, that's a reflection of it. But I think in some ways, we view our world very much through the eyes of our heart and our thoughts and our feelings, as much as through our sort of physical eyes.
I like that very much, yes. It's so evocative, and you paint the scenery incredibly well. Can we come to Rosa Barden? How did she introduce herself to you, this young, headstrong, and I assume rather beautiful young woman?
She is beautiful. She's so beautiful, she gets turned down flat by Florence Nightingale, because Nightingale wasn't going to take anyone attractive with her for reasons to do with, you know, coming up against an army of men who'd been deprived of women for so long. I think with almost all of my more recent novels, I often have two heroines, and it's to do with writing about a time in the past when women were not powerful. And so the way I get round that is to show a woman who's extraordinary. And Rosa Barr is extraordinary because she has an unhappy childhood, but she's brought up very near to where Florence Nightingale lived. So she's in the next valley, and she knows about Florence, is the young Florence, and what a rebel she was, and how, you know, she went out to nurse the local villagers. And Rosa wants to be like Florence. She's been inspired by Florence already by the time the Crimean War breaks out. And I think because of her unhappiness, because she's got a dreadful stepfather, an abusive stepfather, and two stepbrothers, one of whom is Max, who will crop up again later, she is very independent-minded, and she can't bear the constraints of a Victorian womanhood. Whereas my other heroine, Mariela, that's all she wants. She wants the hearth, and she wants her needles to sew with, and that's it.
Well, you say that, that's all Mariela wants, but Mariela has this extraordinary relationship with Rosa. Can you talk us through where you take that?
I think I don't have any sisters, and so I don't think I've ever written about sisters in my novels, but as a result, I think my women friends and my cousins and my in-laws, you know, my relationships with women are very important to me. And I think, but I think women's relationships can be very conflicted. You know, you asked why women didn't succeed in the past. I think women aren't always very kind to each other. And so, you know, Mariela is bowled over by this extraordinary Rosa, who takes her way out of her comfort zone at every possible chance. But she's also intimidated and frightened by her. And I think that's, you know, that kind of balance is what happens throughout the novel. It's and with the best of friendships, what you want is to draw the best out of each other.
Quite. Yeah, that's nicely put. We have to say there are men in this as well.
Oh, there are, yeah.
Not least of all, Henry, who, if memory serves, is Mariela's fiance, who is a surgeon and who heads off also to the Crimea. What role does he play in this?
Well, he actually is part of the inspiration. One of the inspirations for this novel was actually the poet Keats, believe it or not, because he was an apothecary as well as a poet, or, you know, he funded his poetry through being an apothecary for a bit. And I've always felt haunted by the idea of a poet and a medical man who obviously couldn't cure himself. He died of consumption, obviously Keats, very young. And so Henry is that figure, but Henry is also responsible for some of the catastrophe of the Crimean War. You know, he's a very competent doctor. He wants to do good. He goes out before the war starts and thinks, yeah, we've got everything in place, and he hasn't got anything prepared. Nothing is right. And so Mariela is devoted to Henry, but she has to learn during the novel that he's got not feet of clay, but he's just human and vulnerable and not at all the sort of household god she had wanted.
Yes, quite. It's the pulling down of idols in a way, and, the realization that humans are frail, however they deport themselves to the world outside. I don't want to give too much away about the plot of this. Of course, what we really want is people to buy the book and obviously to find out for themselves. But we can say, I think, that Henry falls ill, and that Rosa's communications suddenly cease from the Crimea, which means Mariela has to take a form of action. Is that the way to put it?
Yes, that's exactly it. Because Mariela, not only does she not know where Rosa is, but she has a sneaking suspicion, for reasons that I won't go into, or more than a sneaking suspicion, that Rosa might be involved or embroiled with Henry, her fiance. And one of the reasons that she goes out to the Crimea is that she is afraid that she has been the subject of a terrible betrayal by both of these two people who she loves. You know, she thinks they might be having an affair. And so she follows them partly out of the desire to find Rosa and partly because she's so frightened of what might have happened. And she's egged on by her servant, or a servant called Nora, who's an Irish servant of Rosa's and who is desperate to go and find out what's happened to Rosa and just to see a bit of life.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, Nora's a hell of a character in this. I'd like to talk about what your relationship as the author with the characters that you have created is, and how that changes over the course of a novel. I get the impression you may have had some fun with Nora.
I did have some fun with Nora, because it's funny, you pop a character into a book thinking, well, I need a nursemaid. Nora needs a nursemaid, or I need a link here, and then suddenly you have to start thinking, obviously, about all their background and where they came from. And of course, Nora suddenly realised, I'm sorry to say suddenly so often, but I'm not a very well thought out author to start off with. The Irish potato famine was in the late 1840s. The Crimean War was 1854. And so when I start to look into Nora's background, I realise it's likely that she had been a victim of the famine. And one of the reasons she's so tough is whatever you can face her with, she's seen far worse. Yeah. And she has very little sympathy for Mariela's missishness.
Yes, she's a sort of an anti-Victorian lady in a way, but a fantastic sort of form of of light and dark to she's the sort of dark to the lightness of Mariela, or vice versa. As you,
yes,
it's a counterpoint, is what I'm trying to say.
yeah, and it's once again that thing about women and their interaction together, and of course this class thing that Mariela, she has to overcome that. She thinks she's the, she thinks she's the madam, and she turns out to be not. No higher stakes.
Exactly. We've talked about it enough. I wonder if I might ask you, would you be happy, would you do us the honour, Katharine, of reading an extract from The Rose of Sebastopol?
Yeah, I'd love to, if you can bear it.
Thank you so much.
How much do you want?
Oh, page?
A page?
Page and a half.
So this is the moment when Mariela shows up in Balaclava Harbour. She's the only person wearing a crinoline and carrying a parasol. She alights from the boat. She doesn't have the foggiest what to do. So she's sent along to a little office where this is her greeting. At last we were shown into a little office with a crooked desk and notice boards covered in maps scribbled over with notes, lists and information about ships, masters, regiments and purveyors. The smell of blocked drains was very bad, but otherwise it was a reassuring enough place because it reminded me of Father's study. The official behind the desk was tall and thin, with a long face and mournful eyes, like a well-intentioned mongrel, though his skin had an unhealthy grey tinge and his moustache drooped sadly at either end. He took one look at me and said under his breath, though distinctly enough for me to hear, "Jesus Christ, what will they send me next?" I was so offended that I plumped down on a rickety chair while he sighed, took a clean sheet of paper, dipped his pen and prepared to write. "I'm Lieutenant Barnabas, in charge of arrivals. Your name, madam?" I gave him my name and Nora's. "How did you get here?" "On the Royal Albert." He made a note. "I will give a captain a reprimand. I assume you paid him an enormous sum. Well, I won't have it. We can't allow just anyone to sail in and out of Balaclava as if it were Broadstairs." "I'm looking for my cousin, Rosa Barden. She came out here to nurse and has gone missing." Barnabas's posture did not change, but I was certain that his eyes widened a fraction. "Rosa Barden, you say?"
Beautifully read. Beautifully read. Here's a question. I'm so sorry to ping this to you, Katharine, but I'm intrigued. You said earlier on the 3 years it takes to write, the 3 years it takes to research, that these books, people buy them in a shop, they start at the beginning, they work to the end, and maybe read them in a couple of days or so, and that's it. But of course, you put love and research and thought and consideration into every word, every sentence, and every paragraph. So when The Rose of Sebastopol, for example, is picked up by the Richard and Judy Book Club, when it becomes a Sunday Times bestseller, what does that mean to you?
It meant absolutely everything. It was transformative for my career, and I can't thank them enough. Because I think, it's a very, very crowded field. And how do people choose? How do people make their choices about what to read? Yeah. And I think, so what Richard and Judy did was they pushed this book into prominence. It was suddenly in all the bookshops. When I published this book in the summer, it had no reviews at all. It came out to dead silence. My local paper was lovely and reviewed it, but there was nothing. My heart was literally broken because I had spent so long on this book and it received no notices. And yet Richard and Judy obviously loved it and made it one of their choices. And it was everything, and also it drew people's attention to my backlist. And that's one of the reasons I'm so glad to have the chance to have written a little bit, a new chapter for it, and also to reissued it this year.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's nice to be able to breathe fresh air into what is a fantastic piece of writing. So this is this year, 2020, is the 200th anniversary of the birth of Florence Nightingale.
Yes, May the 12th.
May the 12th, it's just gone by.
Yeah.
You've reissued it. Tell us about this new chapter and how that worked. I'm intrigued to know, from your perspective, Katharine, as the author, what it's like to revisit a work that at some stage in the past you wrote the two crucial words, "the end," sent off to a publisher, and sort of, I would imagine, thought, right, that's it, I'm never going back to that, I might reread it later.
It was a pretty crazy idea in some ways, but one of the things that's disappointed me about The Rose of Sebastopol's reception was that although a lot of people really loved it, from Amazon and from other reviews, I found that they found the ending disappointing, and that always niggled me. Not so much disappointing as inconclusive. And I don't like books that, you know, I've really enjoyed a book and I feel dissatisfied at the end, and it's always niggled me slightly. So I thought, you know, this would be such a brilliant chance to celebrate Nightingale and to look at the book again. But it was really difficult because, you know, I'm changed. I don't write the way I wrote then. I would have approached this book differently, I'm sure. You know, I've written 5 other books, so my craft is different. I had to get to know the characters again. I had to go back to the war and research that again. And then I had to choose what to do with the ending. That was really difficult. Well, one of the most difficult things I've done, actually. Yeah.
I bet it is. I mean, you know, the old adage being you can't step into the same river twice. You've done exactly that. Obviously, I don't want to give anything away, and it's crucial that we don't. But can you talk us through a little bit about how you took this challenge on? Because I'm full of admiration for you for doing so.
Or pity, one of the two. But
definitely admiration. Definitely.
Thank you. Well, I hope it succeeded, but I realised I had a lot of choices. You know, I could have done that thing where you do 10 years later.
Yeah.
I went back to my original thoughts, and I was pretty clear when I finished the book what would happen to Mariela. And you know, I don't want to give the ending away, but I was pretty clear, and I thought I would follow that path. But actually, so many things have happened, both internationally and, you know, obviously to me in those intervening years, that I couldn't write that ending. And so what happened in the end was I was guided by Nightingale. This whole book is seeded absolutely in historical events to the day. I hope the reader doesn't notice that. I hope for them that the book is just a wonderful read in which they're immersed in the Crimean War. But for me, it was very important that every event is sort of pinned to an actual event. So I knew exactly when Nightingale made her own trip from Istanbul to the Crimea. So I was able to sort of date it around her, really. And so I let her guide me in the writing of that chapter.
Was it hard work?
It was hard work. It was exciting work, because you know, you have that thing, you have a deadline, and you know from experience you're going to make it work. But it was, because I had to assimilate so much material so quickly and then get myself back into my old boots.
That's a tough gig. It's a bit of a cheesy after dinner question, but I'm dying to ask it. Given the research you've done, given you've now revisited, you know, Florence twice for research for this book on 2 occasions, and have as your guiding light that your childhood self and the Ladybird book of Florence Nightingale. I mean, if you could spend 5 minutes with her, what would you like to find out? What would you like to ask her?
I'd say to her, are you still angry? I think the guiding force in her life was a kind of rage, first of all against her parents and the society for sort of confining her as a high-born woman to being an angel of the hearth. Yeah. And then against the British Army, the government, for putting soldiers in such a terrible situation in the Crimea, and then against the Army Medical Service and the nursing establishment for not instantly reforming things, for not acknowledging their mistakes. And so she was driven, I think, by anger. And I'd also ask, are you feeling better? Because she was sick a lot of her life.
Yeah, quite. How did you feel when we saw at the start of this appalling scourge of a virus, these extraordinary temporary hospitals being built up and down the land, from the Excel Centre in London to Birmingham to all over, and the fact that they bore the name the Nightingale Hospitals?
It's just so ironic, isn't it? And it's ironic from so many points of view. Not only that they're named after this iconic figure, who I think a lot of people see as the sort of lady with the lamp, as a very passive figure, but she was so far from passive. And she would have been completely enraged by the whole PPE thing. You know, you can't believe that the Crimean War, she found that there was no equipment in the hospitals, that, you know, that there weren't even screens up between people who were being amputated and those who were waiting in the queue. And, you know, she would have really, I think the eyebrows would have shot right up into her cap when she saw the situation with our NHS. And she would have been dead proud as well, I suspect, of the nurses.
proud and furious and wanting to take control is what I had in mind. When
absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely, yeah.
You don't do it like this, you do it like this. What's wrong with you all? It's quite easy to get right.
And I'm going to write 1,000 letters. She wrote so much all the time. She would have been no good at Twitter.
That's lovely. You mentioned, Katharine, that iconic image, the terrible phrase, the lady and the lamp, which is somewhat demeaning to Florence Nightingale, I've always thought. If you wanted readers to come away with a revised image of Florence from their reading of the Rose of Sebastopol, and given that the name Nightingale is now in the ether with these Nightingale hospitals, what would you like people to revise their opinion of Florence Nightingale to, if it's not the Lady of the Lamp?
Somebody extraordinarily bold and refusing to ever be told, lies, or to be repressed or to be kept quiet. And she's the kind of Greta Thunberg. She just did not care what the society thought of her. And that's the image, I think. And she was so patient, so driven, so hardworking. That's what she was like.
Where do you think her morality came from, Katharine?
Sorry?
Where do you think her morality came from?
She was very religious. I think she had a very deep... some people think she had a kind of visions when she was younger. She was very strongly driven by a sense of purpose, that she had a calling, but she couldn't find it until the Crimean War. And I think, obviously, in those days, it was a very moralistic world. I have to say that she had an illegitimate cousin called Barbara Leigh Smith-Bodikon, who was an extraordinary woman in her own right. And Nightingale never acknowledged her because she was born the wrong side of the blanket. So that, she was moralistic in not always the most attractive ways. She didn't accept Mary Seacole into her umbrella.
Yes, quite.
We don't quite know why, but I suspect, there would have been a racial element to it. So she was very much of her time.
Very much, as you say, of her time. Just briefly on Mary Seacole, who I'm sort of slightly obsessed about. Did Florence ever make any reference to Mary in her own writings?
Yes, she did. They made reference to each other. Mary Seacole was somewhat more generous, right. Because I think Mary Seacole needed her book to be published, and mentioning Nightingale was the way to getting that happen. But Nightingale, I think she did see her. Mary Seacole was a businesswoman, and Nightingale, of course, was too high-minded to think that you should ever sort of sell your services to the troops in any way. And Seacole set up a hotel, and she fed them, and she gave board and lodging, and she tried to make money out of the war. That's why she was there, as well as being a fantastic nurse.
Exactly. There was a fantastic thing I read recently about Ellis Island. If you know about the Ellis Island quarantine hospital, as migrants were coming into the United States of America, the hospital that was built there on a purpose-built man-made island was built very much along the lines of what Florence Nightingale had wanted, had designed, what her ideal hospital would have been. And it was just shortly after I was reading this, shortly having reread Rose of Sebastopol, I thought, if only she could have seen this and knew the changes that she'd made, the force for good that she'd become, even in the 20th century.
Extraordinary influence.
What are you working on now, Katharine? What can we expect from you in the future?
I'm writing about Ireland at the moment because I've just got my Irish citizenship.
Congratulations.
Pardon?
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm very excited.
Is this for tax purposes or Brexit purposes?
Brexit purposes. I don't earn enough to have tax issues. But no, and as a result of sort of seeking out my citizenship, it's quite a palaver. You have to go back generations. It's my grandfather who was born in Clare, and that sort of inspired me to write about Ireland. So another complicated situation I've got myself into.
And can you give us any insight into the characters with which you populate it?
It's about a mother and daughter, and it's a generational thing, and it's about people who get caught up in the conflict and with 1916 I'm talking about, and in various ways. But then my job is to junk all the history and just tell my story.
Fantastic. Well, it's what you are best at, and what it's been a real pleasure to talk to you about. Katharine McMahon, thank you so much for joining us on Lockdown LitFest. Thank you so much for writing The Rose of Sebastopol. And it's been a real pleasure to talk to you again.
Thank you, Paul. Lovely to see you.
So we've been talking about The Rose of Sebastopol, written by Katharine McMahon, re-released to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the birth of Florence Nightingale. And if the last chat for the chat for the last 30 minutes or so hasn't drawn you in enough, can we commend it to you? It's a hell of a story, beautifully told. And if you go to the author page for Katharine McMahon here on the Lockdown LitFest website, you'll find a buy the book button, and I commend it to you. Thank you very much for joining us. And as ever, we hope you're taking care. We hope you're well, and we hope you're being safe. Look after yourselves. Bye.